On a Tuesday morning in a small law office in Harmon, Indiana, three grown children sat side by side to hear their father's final wishes. They expected the house. They expected the family store. They expected the modest savings he had spent 40 years building, one careful dollar at a time. What they were handed instead was a single page that made the whole room go quiet. A name none of them had ever heard, tied to 7 words that would end everything they thought they knew. "I leave my entire estate to..." The lawyer paused. Daniel's hands began to shake. Rachel stopped breathing. Mark just stared at the page, waiting for a joke that never came. Their father, Walter Coben, a man who had preached family above everything for 78 years, made one final decision in secret that would tear his own children apart before lunch was even over. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Rachel had not set foot in Harmon in 15 years, and she never imagined the reason she would finally come home was to bury her father and inherit a mystery instead of an answer. Daniel, the son who stayed, who ran the hardware store every single day while his father's health failed, felt something inside him crack quietly in that office. Mark, drowning in debt he had never told his siblings about, had already spent the inheritance in his head before the lawyer finished the sentence. Now all 3 of them needed to know one thing above everything else. Who was this woman their father had chosen over them, and why had Walter Coben kept her a secret for 50 years? The lawyer would not say her name out loud that day. He only confirmed that the woman existed, that she was alive, and that Walter had written her into his will 6 weeks before he died, quietly, without telling a single member of his own family. For 3 grown adults raised to believe their father was the most honest man in Harmon, the silence in that room said more than any explanation could. Something from Walter's past, buried for half a century, had just resurfaced, and it was about to rewrite everything his children believed about the man who raised them. Walter Coben was not a complicated man by any outward measure. He grew up on the edge of Harmon in the 1950s, the son of a factory worker who taught him that a man's word was worth more than his paycheck. He started sweeping floors at the hardware store on Main Street when he was 12 years old, and by the time he was 26, he owned it outright. Neighbors described him as the kind of man who remembered your name, your children's names, and exactly how much you still owed him on layaway, and never once brought it up unless you asked. He married Carol Whitfield in 1976, and together they built the kind of life the whole town measured itself against: Sunday dinners at 6 o'clock sharp, church on Sunday mornings without fail, a house on Elm Street with a porch swing Walter built himself the summer before Daniel was born. To everyone in Harmon, Walter Coben was proof that a good life could still be built with nothing but discipline, patience, and a willingness to work harder than the man next to you. His children grew up inside that same discipline. Daniel was 12 when he started working the counter after school, just like his father had. He gave up a partial scholarship to study engineering 2 states away because Walter's back had started giving out, and someone needed to keep the store running. He never once told anyone that decision haunted him some nights, wondering what his life might have looked like if he had left Harmon when he had the chance. Rachel was the restless one, the daughter who asked too many questions at dinner and never seemed satisfied with the answers she got. At 23, she and Walter had a fight so severe that neither of them ever fully explained it to the rest of the family. She packed 2 suitcases the next morning and moved to Chicago, and for 15 years, she came home only for funerals and the occasional forced holiday, always leaving before anyone could ask her to stay longer. Mark was the baby of the family, the one everyone still treated like he was 17 even after he turned 40. He chased one business idea after another, each one promising to be the thing that finally made him something other than Walter Coben's youngest son. By the time his father got sick, Mark was 3 mortgage payments behind and too proud to tell anyone in his own family the truth about how bad things had gotten. None of them noticed, in all those years, that their father occasionally grew quiet in a very particular way. It happened every year around the same week in October, a silence that would settle over him for 2 or 3 days before lifting completely. Carol used to joke that Walter got a little melancholy when the seasons changed. She never knew, and neither did their children, that October was the month Walter had once made a promise to a young woman named Louise Farrow, and the month 50 years later, he was finally forced to keep it. Walter's diagnosis came on a Thursday in late autumn, delivered in the same flat, careful tone doctors use when there is nothing more to soften. Pancreatic cancer, advanced, 6 weeks if he was fortunate. Daniel remembered his father's face did not change at all when he heard the news, as though some part of him had been expecting this exact conversation his entire life, simply waiting for the date to arrive. The family closed ranks the way families do when time suddenly becomes the only thing that matters. Rachel flew home for the first time in years and did not leave. Daniel ran the store alone from 6 in the morning until closing, then drove straight to his father's house every night to sit by his bed. Mark showed up more than anyone expected him to, quiet in a way his siblings had never seen before, as if he understood, without saying it, that this was his last chance to be the son his father needed. For the first 2 weeks, everything about Walter's decline felt achingly ordinary, the kind of slow goodbye every family fears, and few are ever fully prepared for. Then, in the 3rd week, Daniel noticed his father making phone calls behind a closed bedroom door, calls that stopped abruptly the moment anyone walked past. When Daniel asked who he'd been talking to, Walter simply said it was business, and Daniel, exhausted and grieving in advance, did not push any further. A week later, a lawyer none of the family recognized arrived at the house. Not Walter's longtime attorney of 30 years, but a man from 2 counties over, carrying a briefcase and asking to speak with Walter alone. He came twice more over the following 10 days. Each time, Walter waited until the man left before rejoining the family at the kitchen table, offering no explanation beyond a tired smile and a change of subject. One evening, Walter asked Daniel a question that would echo in his mind for weeks afterward. He asked, almost casually, if something happened to him, who in the family Daniel trusted most to make things right. Daniel assumed his father meant the store, the finances, the ordinary business of a life ending. He answered honestly. He had no idea his father was really asking something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with hardware inventory or bank accounts, and everything to do with a debt 50 years overdue. In Walter's final week, Rachel found him one afternoon sitting at his desk, staring at a blank envelope with only 2 letters written on the front in his shaking handwriting. The period F period. When she asked what it meant, Walter folded the envelope and slid it into the top drawer without answering, telling her only that some things a man has to finish on his own terms. She let it go, assuming it was grief talking, or medication, or simply a mind beginning to drift. She would think of that envelope every single day for the rest of her life. Walter Coben died on a Sunday morning in November, surrounded by his children in the same house he had raised them in. The funeral 3 days later drew nearly the entire town of Harmon, a testament to 50 years of quiet, consistent decency. Neighbors spoke of a man who never once let them down. His children stood at the front of the church, grieving a father they believed they had known completely, with no idea that his final act was already in motion, waiting behind a lawyer's door to detonate everything they thought they understood about him. 3 days after the funeral, an envelope arrived at the family attorney's office, not from Walter, but from someone none of the children had ever heard of, a woman asking simply when the will would be read. The lawyer, bound by Walter's explicit instructions, could say nothing more. All he could do was schedule the meeting Walter had arranged 6 weeks earlier, the same meeting that would bring 3 grieving children face to face with a stranger's name and a sentence that would change every one of their lives. That meeting, the one that opened this story, was not the beginning of the mystery. It was only the moment the mystery became impossible to ignore. In the days that followed, Daniel, Rachel, and Mark stopped being simply grieving children and became something closer to investigators, determined to understand who Louise Farrow was and why their father had trusted her with everything he had built. Daniel started where any careful man would, going back through his father's old paperwork stored in the office above the hardware store. Rachel, still haunted by the fight she'd had with Walter 15 years earlier, began to wonder for the first time if that argument had somehow been connected to a name she had never heard until now. Mark, desperate and impatient, wanted to contest the will immediately, convinced this Louise Farrow was some kind of con artist who had manipulated a dying man in his final weeks. For a few tense days, that theory took hold of the entire family. It was the easiest explanation, and the one that hurt the least. A stranger had taken advantage of their father's weakened state, and any real investigation would prove it. Daniel called every mutual friend and business contact he could think of, asking the same question over and over. Had anyone ever heard their father mention a woman named Louise Farrow? Every single answer came back the same. Number. Rachel, working a different angle, drove out to the county records office and requested every document connected to her father's estate filing. Buried in the paperwork was a name she recognized instantly, the 2 counties over lawyer who had visited the house in Walter's final weeks. She tracked down his office and, after considerable pressure, learned only one detail he was willing to confirm. He had been hired specifically because he had no prior connection to the Coben family or their usual attorney, someone Walter trusted precisely because he had no reason to talk. Mark, meanwhile, hired a private investigator, using money he genuinely did not have. One final bet that this would be the thing that finally paid off. Within a week, the investigator located Louise Farrow, 74 years old, living quietly 2 states away in a small house outside Fort Wayne. She had no criminal record, no history of targeting dying men, nothing that matched the story the family had been telling themselves to make sense of their father's decision. When Daniel finally reached her by phone, Louise did not sound like a stranger trying to hide anything. She sounded like someone who had been waiting 50 years for this exact conversation, relieved, in a strange and quiet way, that it was finally happening. She agreed to meet him in person, telling him only that what she had to say was not something that belonged on a phone call. Daniel drove the 2 hours alone, telling no one, not entirely sure if he was walking toward the truth or toward another version of the story his family had already settled on. Louise Farrow opened her front door before Daniel even reached the porch, as though she had been watching for his car the entire morning. She was smaller than he expected, with the kind of steady eyes that immediately made him feel like the one being studied rather than the other way around. She invited him inside, sat him down at her kitchen table, and told him she had been waiting 50 years to tell someone in Walter's family the truth. In 1974, Louise explained, she and Walter had been engaged 2 years before he ever met Carol. They were young, deeply in love, and completely unprepared for what came next when Louise discovered she was pregnant. Her family, deeply religious and terrified of the shame it would bring on their name in a town as small as Harmon, forced her to leave before anyone could find out. She was sent to live with a distant relative 3 states away, and told, in no uncertain terms, that if she ever came back, she was to come back alone. Walter, only 24 himself and with no money, no standing, and no way to fight her family's decision, was left behind with nothing but a promise he made to Louise the night before she disappeared. He swore that someday, somehow, he would make things right. He did not know, for years afterward, that Louise had given birth to a son, or that the child had been placed for adoption, before she was ever allowed to hold him for more than a few minutes. Louise did not resurface in Walter's life for nearly 50 years. It was only after her own diagnosis, the same disease that would eventually take Walter as well, that she finally found the courage to write to him, not asking for anything, simply telling him the truth she had carried alone her entire adult life. She told him he had a son who had grown up not far from Harmon, closer than either of them could have ever imagined, and that she believed, before either of them ran out of time, Walter deserved to know exactly what he had lost. What Louise told Daniel next was the detail that would change the shape of the entire story. The son Walter never knew he had grown up under a different name, adopted by a family in a neighboring county, and had spent the last 20 years living quietly in Harmon itself. Daniel felt the air leave his chest as Louise said the name out loud, a name he recognized instantly, because it belonged to a man his family had known for years, without ever once suspecting the truth standing right in front of them. His name was Nathan Price, the quiet, steady accountant who had handled the hardware store's books for nearly 15 years, a man Walter had trusted with every financial detail of his life, without either of them ever knowing the deeper connection between them. The mysterious phone calls in Walter's final weeks, the unfamiliar lawyer, the private meetings behind closed doors, all of it suddenly made sense. Walter had not been hiding a betrayal. He had been quietly, carefully finding his own son for the first time in 50 years, and running out of time to make things right before he died. Daniel drove back to Harmon that night with Louise's words replaying in his mind over and over. trying to figure out how to explain any of this to Rachel and Mark. Their father had not chosen a stranger over his own children. He had spent his final 6 weeks alive trying to correct the one mistake he had never been able to forgive himself for. A mistake made when he was 24 years old, and powerless to stop his own family from tearing his future apart. When Daniel finally told Rachel and Mark everything Louise had shared with him, the room went quiet in a way none of them expected. Rachel was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper, saying she finally understood the fight she'd had with her father 15 years earlier. She had once asked him, half joking, if there was anything from his past he had never told the family, and Walter's reaction had been so sharp, so uncharacteristically cold, that she left the house that night and did not come back for years, certain she had touched something he never wanted uncovered. Mark, who had spent the last 2 weeks convinced Louise Farrow was a con artist, sat in silence for a long time before admitting quietly that he had been wrong about all of it. The private investigator he had hired to expose a stranger had, without meaning to, helped uncover a brother none of them knew existed. For the first time since the will was read, the anger in the room began to shift into something closer to grief, and underneath the grief, something that almost resembled understanding. Nathan Price learned the truth about his own biological parents only days after Daniel first spoke with Louise, delivered gently by Louise herself, in a phone call 50 years in the making. He had grown up knowing he was adopted, but had never once imagined the family he came from was the same family whose books he had balanced for 15 years, the same man whose store he walked past nearly every day of his adult life without ever knowing the truth standing right in front of him the whole time. The first meeting between Nathan and his 3 half-siblings took place at Daniel's house, tense and quiet at first. 4 adults who had spent their entire lives on opposite sides of a secret none of them had chosen. Rachel later admitted she expected to feel resentment sitting across from him, but instead felt something closer to recognition, the strange familiarity of a stranger who somehow already fit inside the shape of their family. Mark, always the most guarded of the 3, was the first to reach across the table and shake Nathan's hand. Over the following weeks, something none of them expected began to happen. Instead of fighting over the inheritance, the 4 of them chose, together, to divide their father's estate evenly, 4 ways instead of 3, an act none of Walter's original will required but one that felt, to all of them, like the only way to finish what their father had started. It was not a legal correction, it was a quiet act of repair, the kind of decision Walter himself might have made had he lived long enough to see his children meet the son he never had the chance to raise. Walter Coben spent 50 years as the most trusted man in Harmon, Indiana, a reputation built on decades of quiet consistency and hard work. But the debt he carried was never measured in dollars, and it never appeared on any ledger Nathan Price ever balanced for him. It was measured in a promise made at 24 years old, broken by circumstances entirely out of his control, and finally, in the last 6 weeks of his life, kept in the only way he had left. Was Walter's final decision a betrayal of the children who gave up everything to stay by his side, or was it the truest act of loyalty a man like him could offer, a last attempt to make right the one wrong he was never given the chance to fix? Would you have made the same choice in his place, and would you have forgiven him the way his children eventually did?